Through his work, Curtis felt that the Indian could live on, down through the generations. Curtis's portraits of the great chiefs of North America were some of the last portraits of these men that were ever taken, and some of the best. Curtis seemed to capture their last bit of majesty and dignity in their broken and weary conditions. Quote, "It was a period of painful transition for the Indians when Curtis began his work. Red Cloud was almost 90, blind and dreaming of the days when his people were once monarchs of all they surveyed. Geronimo, 76 and subdued in spirit, was virtually a prisoner at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, growing watermelons and tending his small vegetable patch. Joseph, the last of the Nez Perce non-treaty chiefs, had been confined to the Colville Reservation at Nespille in Washington when Curtis first made his acquaintance." End quote. These great warriors and leaders, once mythic in their valor, were reduced to prisoners, forced to live upon reservations. The great chiefs, some of the last to have seen the true Indian way of life, were dying. In 1913, Joseph K. Dixon, whom Curtis denounced as an imitator of his work, set out on an expedition to photograph and record the customs of the vanishing race. He was commissioned and financed by Rodman Wanamaker, who called together a council of the great Indian chiefs. Wanamaker's purpose was to create a memorial on Staten Island for the Native Americans. The project never happened, but Dixon's accounts, photographic and written, still remain. In Trail of the Death Spirit, Dixon captured an Indian coffin borne up to the sky on stilts, solemn and monumental before the sunset. Quote, "The Indian buries his dead upon some high elevation, because it is a nearer approach to the spirit world." End quote. Edward Curtis shows a similar scene in his photograph, Burial Platform. The burial platforms in these photos seem to be symbolic, monuments borne up to the sky as the last light of life, that setting sun, fades forever on the Indian race. Perhaps even more than the natives themselves, Dixon and Curtis foresaw the imminent death of their way of life and culture, and their photographs tell of the Indian of the day, the last of his kind, dying away. Dixon's portraits of the chiefs are some of his most famous. Hearing each chief's story, he coupled their portraits with accounts of their lives. One chief, Chief Plenty Coups of the Crow Nation, stands proudly with his warrior's costume. But though Chief Plenty Coups had a great deal of experience in war, he had never battled with a white man. Instead, he advocated a good relationship with whites, knowing that the future of his tribe depended on it. He felt an urgency to, quote, "raise up young men who shall know the rights and opportunities of his people, and who shall thus have an influence at Washington." End quote. Chief Tintin Meetsaw of the Umatillas felt less optimistic about the future of his nation, though still full of dignity. Dixon described Tintin Meetsaw as, quote, "bent and tottering with his more than 80 years of life, this noble old face still wearing great dignity, his almost sightless eyes looking for the last flicker of life's sunset, presenting a pathetic picture as he faced the firelight and told of his loneliness as he passed the deserted buffalo trails." End quote. Tintin Meetsaw came to the plains for the council and saw the devastation that the white man had wreaked upon the landscape. Quote, "I have traveled all over this country many times, long years ago, as we came here to hunt the buffalo. I had a number of fast horses with which I could easily kill as many buffalo as I wanted, but I only killed as many as I needed to last for a few days. When I came here the other day to meet all the chiefs, and I looked at this country for the last time, I felt lonesome when I saw how it was all changed and all of the buffalo gone out of the country. For I could still see traces of these large animals. The buffalo is gone, and I am soon going." End quote. A Dixon photograph entitled "Buffalo Thundered Across the Plains" shows a time when the buffalo were plentiful. With the near extinction of this animal they so heavily depended upon, the Plains Indians had no choice but to live upon reservations. Much of Dixon's work is symbolic of the widespread idea of the vanishing race, the disappearance of tribal culture. In one work, The Fading Sunset, Indian chiefs stand regal against the dying of the light, symbolic of the dying of Indian culture. In a glimpse backward, an Indian chief sits regally, his coop stick stands erect in the ground, a monument to past victories. He looks down upon the plains, reflecting, perhaps on a former way of life that has ceased to exist, as the title of the photograph would suggest. He is the last of his kind. Quote, Indian trails are no longer worn deep through the prairie sod. They have been growing ever more dim and indistinct. It is today the thin red line, a swift gathering of all that is left in the gloaming after the sunset. End quote. But not all photographs of Native Americans were taken as art. As great numbers of westward migrating Americans sought lives full of wealth and opportunity, demanding more and more land to hold more and more settlers, the need for an advocate for the Native Americans, a spokesperson, was great. Native American tribes inhabited these lands rich in resources, and their civilizations became little more than an obstacle to whites who sought gold mines that lay just beneath the soil, lumber in the forests, or even just land to cultivate or to live upon. Often whites succeeded in getting rid of this obstacle. Some photographers sought to bring some justice to the red man, whether by documenting his culture for future generations, making him immortal, at least in pictures, or even by directly fighting for his legal right to the land, producing photographic evidence of the injustice he suffered. One such photographer, Warren K. Moorhead, documented land fraud abuses of Ojibwa allotments, reserved for the tribe by the federal government on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. Corporations sought the land of the White Earth Reservation for its valuable white pines and began to take the land from the Indians through persuasion, drink, and legal trickery. They often took advantage of natives who could not speak English. One Indian girl who knew English decided to test out the man who paid the Indians for their allotments. Pretending to know only the native language, she watched as he counted out small bills into what might appear to a native, ignorant of American money, to be the full amount. He was only counting out a fraction of the full price, and, quote, she, waiting until he had counted the money, then said in English, "Don't you think you'd better count that over?" He flushed and stammered and made good the full amount to each sister, end quote. Sometimes the whites would get Indians drunk in order to persuade them to sign a contract selling their land. Other times, whites lied about the meaning of these papers, persuading Indians into signing a document they could not understand. Quote, bankers and real estate men stood in their office doors and laughed heartily as the poor Indians drove away after conducting their business. End quote. Cheating Native Americans, in one way or another, was common. Moorhead wished to prove that lands given to the Ojibwa by the federal government were being stolen by legal trickery, taking photographic evidence and testimony from the people. In one photograph, he shows the tents of white speculators, set up in the reservation in order to take the land. He also documented the poor state of health of the natives, as in his picture of a blind Ojibwa man. He succeeded in helping many individual cases, and at the end of his, The American Indian, suggests reform for the Board of Indian Affairs. The images made by these photographers of Native Americans, just as the painters before them, reveal a conflicted picture of the Native American, a paradox, just as conflicted as when the European settlers first saw them. Despite this complex view that the photographers sometimes give us, the photographs are nevertheless a great treasure recording the original culture of America. The romanticism of the Indian as portrayed by Curtis and Dixon has great poignancy today, for we know that in the end, many tribes as they once were have vanished, just as the artists predicted. Their photographs give us a window into that former America, one of the only windows we have that looks upon the emotions and spirit of the Native Americans.